Buck Russell had always been the black sheep of the family.
I'm stunned that I'm related to you.
Until one night.
Buck, we have a problem with the kids. We're stuck for somebody to watch them.
Oh, please, not that.
Can we trust him?
He's my brother, for God's sake.
I won't let him get into that Satan stuff or any of the new chicks. I'll leave that for me. Wow. I'm kidding, huh?
Now, he's making them breakfast,
Cigar?
No thanks.
making them lunch, and making them crazy.
What did you do?
What does he like to drink? I've been leaving the toilet seats up. Is that what the blue water is? It's not good for him, huh?
Uncle Buck, the new comedy from John Hughes.
You have much more hair on your nose than my dad.
How nice of you to notice.
I'm a kid, that's my job.
Coming soon.
Okay, what I want to know first thing is, how many of you have ever had a background check done on you? Okay, is that nearly everybody, huh? Anybody not had a background check done on you? One or two, okay, yeah, very, very few. Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, these days, background check's kind of one of those things. It doesn't matter whether you're going to get a job or, all kinds of stuff, get a loan, or it doesn't matter, all kinds of things that you have to get a background check for. So let me ask you this question. How many of you ever done a background check on your family? You know, a family tree thing, it's known as a family tree. You ever done one of them? Yeah, we don't have much in our family tree. There's not much records anyway. There's a few people back there, but, maybe I just prefer not to know who they are. I don't know. You never know what you're going to find back in your family tree, horse thieves or something like that. You never can tell. Now, let me just welcome you to GraceLife.tv El Paso campus today. Glad that you're with us this morning. It's really good to have you here. And welcome as well to all those who are viewing us online around the United States and actually literally all over the world. We have people all over the world watching this, so we're just glad to have you with us here today. It's awesome. This is 3 days or so before Christmas. And what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be doing a quick background check on Jesus. If we can do that, I think we can do that, and see what kind of people he might have had in his family tree. Because you never know, with my family tree, I didn't know if there might be some horse thieves back there, and you might not either. There might be some horse thieves, or who knows, all kinds of people back in your family tree, and you may not want to know that once you find out. I don't know. So we're going to do a quick background check on Jesus and see what kind of people he might have had in his background, in his family tree. How many of you ever read the genealogies of Jesus in the Bible? There's one in Matthew and there's one in Luke. Anybody ever read those? Well, don't bother. They're just real boring. I've noticed that most of you haven't, so that's probably a good thing. It's just kind of boring. But, there's a lot of those kind of things in the Bible, seems like. Back in the Old Testament, there's some of those back there too, and they get pretty extensive and lots of names you can't pronounce and all that kind of stuff. But interestingly, what's interesting about the two genealogies that are in the New Testament that have to do with Jesus and his background and his family tree is that both of those genealogies, if you've ever read them, they're both different. They don't have the same people in them. They're both different. And they're totally different. The genealogy found in Matthew is completely different from the one that's found in Luke. Well, my question was, and what I wanted to find out was, why is that? Why are they different? Why are those two family trees different? Well, I think if you're thinking about that, you probably have already come to the conclusion that one of them is from his mom's side, the other one's from his dad's side, right? Well, that's true. Because Matthew records the genealogy of Jesus through Joseph, his legal father, through Joseph, his legal father, while Luke traces the genealogy of Jesus through Mary, his real mother. Okay, now you realize, of course, with the Christmas story, that Joseph is not his real father. Joseph is actually his stepfather, I guess that would be correct. And so he's his legal father, certainly, but Mary is his real mother. So Matthew is concerned with proving that Jesus is the legal heir to the throne through David, down through Joseph. And you remember David's that really important guy in the Old Testament, while Luke proves that Jesus is David's blood descendant through his real mother, Mary. Okay, so there's on both sides of that fence, they're proving that he is in that royal line. The fact is, God had promised David in 2 Samuel 7:16, he said, "Your house and your kingdom." Now, those two things are both the things we just talked about, right? The bloodline and the royal line are both traced here in the New Testament, one through Matthew and one through Luke, tracing both of those things. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. So that's what's happening in the New Testament, is that they're proving to us that both his house or his line, his bloodline, as well as his kingship, the authority that he has to be in the line of the kingdom, to be a king, is there as well. So I'm sure you've already guessed that neither the genealogy found in Matthew nor the genealogy in Luke are complete genealogies, of course. They're pretty short, actually, and you could read through that in just a couple of seconds probably. You'd be bored to death by the time you got done, but they're there, and it might be good to kind of look through those sometime. And I'm really glad that they're not complete. I'm glad that they're abbreviated, that they're very severely abridged. Is that the right way to say that? I don't know. I'm glad it's that way, because if they were complete or anywhere near complete, over a couple of thousand years worth of descendants, that would just take forever to list all that stuff, It'd be horrible. Well, this is the bloodline. This is the Simpson family tree. Bart Simpson, way down there. Yeah. Of course, that means that of necessity, because of the fact that we've got thousands of years of descendants, that they have to abbreviate them. You got to abbreviate them severely. That also means that the few people that are listed, right? I mean, you'd want to list people in there that are important people. You'd pick out a few of them that say, okay, this is important, that guy's important, this person's important, and those are the few that we're going to put in there to kind of lead you down through, what's happening here, and finally get down to the person we're talking about, either Mary or Joseph. So in other words, meaning that those people that are in these highly abridged versions of Jesus' genealogy, that those people had to be picked out specifically for a reason, right? I mean, if you were to abridge yours or to abbreviate your family tree through, say, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 generations, you'd probably pick out just a few key people. Maybe you pick out some important ones. Somebody who had high social standing, or somebody who had invented something important, or somebody who was really smart, or maybe somebody who was really, really tall or big. In my family tree, my great-grandfather, I think that's right, maybe great-great-grandfather, they say was like 7.5 or almost 8 feet tall. That's what they say. I don't know that there's any actual facts that support that, but the story that's been passed down through our family for generations, last several generations, my dad told me that they had to make a special casket to put him in because he was such a huge man and extremely strong and all those kind of stuff. So that's the person I'd want to list in my family tree. There's something interesting there, something to be said about that. So I think that we would probably do the same. I'd probably do the same, but if you did on the other hand, if you did a study of your family tree, and let's say that you were related to somebody like Jeffrey Dahmer. Y'all remember who he is, who cut up people, put them in his freezer, and ate them later. Wow. Or maybe Adolf Hitler, somebody like that. If you found somebody like that in your family tree, and you were going to do a highly abridged version of a highly abbreviated version of your family tree, would you include those people? Probably not. You'd probably skip over them and go, well, maybe not. I'd rather forget about those guys, not have those listed in my family tree, I don't think I'd do that. I don't think I'd do it. And I certainly wouldn't write a book that lists those people and lays it out for you as to how they fit into the family tree and spell it out for everybody to see. So it stands to figure, at least in my mind, and maybe yours as well, that when it comes to the genealogies of Jesus, the Messiah, you would expect the New Testament writers to pick out people who were important, same way we would, to pick out people who were the best ones, the cream of the crop, to put those people on the short list, on an abbreviated genealogy, to put some of those important people on a short list especially for the Messiah. You'd expect the New Testament writers to do that. I mean, I could understand if there's a bad guy or two in your family tree, or one or two people you would be listed in the exhaustive version that you couldn't maybe get rid of. I mean, it was there, and you hope maybe people didn't find out about it. But I doubt that you'd want to include them in the short version, especially if you're trying to prove that you're the king of the Jews. You'd want the best and the highest and the most important people in the abbreviated version. However, what's interesting and what's really kind of strange in some ways about the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew is that you'll find that there are several, not just one, there are several, shall we say, unwholesome characters that are listed in his highly abbreviated version of his genealogy. It seems a little strange at the outset to say that here we've got an extremely abbreviated version of his family tree, and they've picked out some quite unwholesome characters to list in that highly abbreviated version. Let me show you what I mean. And I'm going to pick out just a few, and I'm going to pick on some specific ones mostly because they're female, and females just aren't listed in the genealogies in the Old Testament. It just doesn't happen. When the Old Testament times, they just didn't do that. As a matter of fact, I lived up in northern New Mexico for a number of years, and in the Hispanic culture, at least up in that area, the person who was listed, or the person who got the family inheritance and who would be listed in the family tree, if anybody was going to be listed, was the eldest son. Didn't matter how many daughters were born before that. When it comes down to the person who's going to get the family inheritance, it will be the firstborn son. And even today, it's still that way. The girls, the women are just kind of, fend for yourself kind of a thing, I guess. But I do know that the guys, the firstborn son, is always the most important. That's just kind of the way it's just a cultural thing. And same way in the Old Testament, it's kind of a cultural thing. And all through the Bible times, it seems was kind of a cultural thing. And so I'm going to pick on those specifically just because of that reason. Because it's strange, first of all, that there would be women that are listed in Jesus' genealogy, because you just don't do that, in the Old Testament time. You read through those genealogies, they very rarely, if ever, had women listed. So, as a matter of fact, they always include the male children, not the female children. But if there was one of the children were to marry someone, one of the guys was to marry someone who was not a Jew or a Jewish descent, that person just wouldn't be included in the family tree at all. They just basically don't exist. So it's quite interesting when it comes to Jesus' family tree that 4 women are listed. Not just 1, not just 2. Count them. 4. 4 women are listed out of just a few people that are listed in the short list of his family tree. Not that, but every one of the 4 women, these 4 women were women who had rather shady backgrounds, or was shady reputation, or at least was a foreigner, which was totally unheard of and uncalled for in that sense of the word. So check this out. Tamar is the first one. The first woman mentioned in Matthew 1:3 is Tamar. And her story is found in Genesis chapter 38. Way back there in Genesis 38. And they picked her out of the bunch and said, okay, we're going to put her in the short list for Jesus' family tree. The Bible tells us that Judah had 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah, and Tamar was chosen by Judah to marry his first son. But he was killed before they could have any kids, so according to the custom of that day, she married the second son that came along. She married him. But the Bible tells us that he refused to bear children by her. Now, what exactly that means, I don't know, other than it may be that he just flat refused to sleep with her. Maybe she was ugly. I just wondering. I don't know. But he refused. Maybe he had other issues going on in his life. I don't know. But he spitefully refused to bear children by her, and then he died too. The Bible doesn't say how, I don't think. And so when Tamar realized then that Judah was not going to allow her to marry his youngest son, which was next in line and would have been the proper thing to do, she decided that since the dad wasn't going to let her marry the youngest son and they would carry on the family inheritance in that way, that she devised this plan what she did, she's dressed up like a prostitute, and she stood on the street corner waiting for her father-in-law to come by, and she seduced him, and he slept with her, and she had a child by him. As a matter of fact, they had twin sons by that particular union, by her father-in-law, which would be basically incest, Paris and Zerah. And so Paris is listed as he's in the bloodline through which Joseph was born, who is Jesus' legal father. That's all we know about Tamar. That's all we know about her. Nothing else really is said about her. But she's the one that's listed. Now, I realize Judah was just as wrong as she was. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying here they've picked out a woman, and they've picked out a woman who decided to commit incest with her father-in-law and then put her in Jesus' family tree. Okay. So no matter how you view as the bad guy here in this particular account, neither Tamar, in my opinion, neither Tamar nor Judah, her father-in-law, would be the kind of person that I'd want to list in the family tree of the Messiah, at least, if you're picking out a short list. Neither one of those people would be ones that I would list in the short list for the Messiah, Jesus, the Messiah. Rahab is another one, and probably all of you have heard of Rahab. You know about Rahab. You've read her story. She's mentioned in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. And probably most of us know Rahab is simply a prostitute. She's called that in the Bible, that she was a harlot in the King James version, if that's what you prefer, a prostitute. And quite honestly, that's exactly how she made her living. That's what she did, right? But you may remember that she was the person who helped the Israelite spies escape from Jericho by letting them down through the window and outside the city. And because of her faith in God, she was not Jewish. She was, because of her faith in God, God not only spared her life and the lives of her family members because of that particular incident, but she is the only woman out of these four that we're talking about here, 3 or 4 that we're talking about here today, who is actually mentioned by name in 2 other places in the New Testament. Interesting. She's mentioned in 2 other places in the New Testament as being an example of faith. A woman, first of all, and a prostitute, right? And listed in Jesus' family tree. Now, it's kind of interesting because Rahab, in particular, has her benefactors. There's a segment of religious leaders and those writers, Christian writers and the like, who have been unwilling to admit that Rahab had this disreputable character, that they just don't want to admit that. So they've devised all kinds of other stories down through the ages. Many have tried to clean up her image by saying that she was merely an innkeeper, not a prostitute. Well, why would they do that? See, there's another question. Why would they go to a lot of great lengths to try to prove that she wasn't a prostitute, other than the fact that she's listed in Jesus' family tree, and these church leaders, these theologians try to clean up her act because they know that it taints Jesus' family tree, his lineage. So they try to make her look like somebody that she's not because they don't want the Messiah. In other words, they're proving by their actions that they would never include a person like that in Jesus' family tree. Therefore, God must not have done that. She must not have been the kind of person we think she was, Okay, the third woman that's mentioned in Jesus' genealogy is Bathsheba. And probably many or a lot of you know who Bathsheba is. In Matthew identifies her in this way in verse 6. He says that to Jesse was born, Jesse was the father of David the king. David was the father of Solomon by Bathsheba, who had been the wife of Uriah. Now notice how she is listed. Had been the wife of Uriah. Was she not also the wife of David, the king? Yes. But she is listed specifically as had been the wife of Uriah. So it's a specific thing saying, listen, you need to know who she is. Her husband was killed. Well, how was he killed? You remember David was the guy, the king, who was on his rooftop, and he was looking over on her rooftop while she was taking a bath, and he said, whoa, man, we need to get her over here now, Well, being the king, she probably had no choice. In her defense, I doubt that she had any choice but to go and to be with the king. He slept with her. She got pregnant. David got afraid that somebody would find out what he had done, so he called her husband Uriah in from the battlefield, and he said, come home for a few days, spend some time with your wife, chill out, we'll send you back out, everything will be okay, right? Well, David's plan was that once Uriah came home, he would sleep with his wife. She would be pregnant, of course, by David. Nobody would know the difference. Everybody would think that the kid belonged to Uriah and not to David, and nobody would know any different. Well, Uriah was a very, what's the word I want? He was a good soldier. When he came home, he said, you know what, my buddies are out there, and I understand, I've never been in the military, but I understand from guys that I've talked to that when they're home on furlough or home, from the front lines, that they often feel guilty because their buddies are still back there. I've talked to guys that are like that say, I don't feel comfortable here. I need to be back with my guys because they're in danger and I need to be helping them, right? Well, Uriah felt the same way, and so he refused to even sleep in the same house with his wife, much less with his wife. He stayed somewhere else, which foiled David's plan. So, instead of letting it go at that, well, David was going to get caught, right? So David decided that, well, he got pissed off what he did, and he said, all right, he called him in, he said, all right, called his sergeant, I want you to put this guy on the front lines when you send him back out. And when you put him on the front lines, he's surely going to be killed. Sure enough, he was. Is that not murder? Yeah, it is. It's murder. He put out a hit on the guy. And it worked, right? So, so you've got Bathsheba, who committed adultery, number one. You've got David, who also committed adultery, and that he committed an outright murder. He put out, a hit on the guy and had him killed. He's a murderer in my books, and probably in yours as well. And yet, Bathsheba is mentioned in Jesus' genealogy and as being the wife of Uriah. Now, what's interesting about this, to me at least, is that, let me just finish that story. After a period of mourning, for Uriah, David had went and married Bathsheba so that everything would look legal and all that kind of stuff. And then David, through Bathsheba, is the one through whom Mary was born. Jesus was born to Mary, his physical mother, his real mother, making Jesus a blood descendant of a king. Now, so we got a real problem now in my book, because not only do we have Bathsheba who committed adultery, well, she probably didn't have a choice, but we've got David And he's the guy that God promised that his line and his kingdom, that would be where the Messiah would be born through. And here he's not only a murderer and an adulterer, all those kind of things, but he's the guy through whom the Messiah would be born. And then Bathsheba is listed as well as being the former wife of Uriah. We got a mess here, if you ask me. I mean, I wouldn't want David listed in my family tree, much less, Rahab or some of the others. I don't know. It's just crazy. I mean, that's quite a list, ain't it? And those are just a few. There's probably others that have rather shady character, backgrounds as well, if you did a background check on them, right? So I'm going to tell you that Jesus' family tree has quite a few knots on it. He's got some skeletons in the closet, and they're not in the closet no more. They've taken them out of the closet and they've set them up for everybody to see. He's got some pretty bad knots on that tree. Not exactly what one might consider to be a good lineage, especially for the Son of God to be born into. I mean, if I were God, I don't believe I would have included these people in the book that's been the best-selling book for generation upon generation upon generation, to just dirty, air your dirty laundry in public kind of a thing. I don't think I'd want the whole world to know that. The Son of God has so many shady characters in his background. So the question is, why? Why do you suppose God did that? Because God is the Holy Spirit's the one who moved these writers in the New Testament to write what they wrote. I mean, why would God purposely then, because we already talked about that fact, it had to be purposely included in the short list in order to find it, in order to be there. Those people were picked out specifically. So why would God purposely include people with such a shady reputation in the short list of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah? Well, I think I can tell you why, and you may have already guessed the reason why. Because God wants all of us to know. Here's the reason. Because God wants all of us to know that His grace extends to every person. That it's not about who we are or what we've done or what our lives are like or what our lives will be like. Because He loves us for who we are. And because Jesus has already taken care of the sin issue once and for all. So that it doesn't matter what your life has been like. It doesn't even matter what your life is like right now, or, because your sins are not what's standing between you and God. Because Jesus took care of that issue, and that's the point here. Is God is proving to us again and again and again that our actions, the things that we do or the things that we don't do not change our standing before God. But we continually insist that they do. We just simply need to take God at His word. He proves it over and over and over again. Says, listen, it doesn't matter. That's not what this is about. It's not about who you are or what you've done or what you're doing right now. It's about the fact that Jesus has already taken care of that sin issue and opened the door wide open for us to just step into the very presence of God. So He's gone to great lengths to prove to us again and again and again that everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. So when you think about the Christmas season, I know you all think about all the other things as well, that Jesus was born and those kind of things, but think about His genealogy and what that means to us. What that means to you is that your background don't matter. If these people's background doesn't matter, if it don't matter that what their background is like, they found their way. God purposely put them in the short list of the genealogy of the Messiah. Then why would He put you outside of His sphere of influence? Why would He set you aside and say, oh no, you're too bad? He wouldn't. God's awesome, guys. God's awesome. And he proves it to us over and over and over again. And here again, during Christmas, we see again that God is proving to us again that what we do or don't do isn't the issue. It's whether we believe that he is who he says he is. That's what's important. God's awesome. Lord bless you all. Amen. Give God a hand.